So, welcome to this Q&A with Benjamin de Werker about his short film 100 Steps that he directed together with Barbara Wagner, who can't be here today, but welcome, Benjamin. So,
Thank you, Tanya.
please tell us about what was the concept behind this film. You've just been telling me that you also have shows in museums and galleries. So, what was the concept behind it?
Okay, well, I guess it probably would be good to start at the very, very beginning in terms of where the interest to make a film that looks at traditional music coming from Ireland, and in the instance of 100 Steps, it developed further into a comparison, let's say relatively a comparison between traditional music from Ireland and the music from North Africa in France as it exists within the film structure. But at the very initial interest developed much earlier when I initially thought about making a project for funding application. And in the instance, I initially applied for funding in Ireland. And the idea then, of course, developed further beyond, it expanded beyond that through the process of our research, which is often the case. We maintain an openness to the experimental nature of our film work. But initially I applied for funding in, I think, 2018. And as you know, the film was developed in 2020, so it's a good bit earlier. In 2017, I realized that with what was happening in the United Kingdom with Brexit, created a sort of a dynamic in Ireland, where I grew up, in fact, where people kind of understood a degree of change, let's say a societal change in terms of the dynamic of how they perceive themselves, how Irish people perceive themselves as Irish, or as a nation, or as a peoples in general. And I think leading up to Brexit, maybe it wasn't so much in the public psyche to think about how much of a measure of change had occurred since the instigation of the European project allowed the Irish people to see themselves more as European and less as, let's say, a post-colonial subject of Great Britain, because there was a lot of animosity and a lot of negative emotions felt in Ireland due to the continuous civil war in the north of Ireland. And when the European project occurred and the Irish people started to identify themselves much more as being another European country, that dynamic shifted over, let's say, a 20-year period from the 90s. And I understood that more through returning to Ireland, where I grew up, and seeing that people's understandings of themselves as a small island, somehow still connected to Great Britain, shifted an attention to being one of the European countries with an equal importance in relation to the European countries. So when Brexit occurred, it retouched on a lot of these questions that were maybe more in a dynamic situation of more debated in Ireland in the 80s and 90s, let's say.
Mm-hmm. So that was your point of departure. And how did you come across this mansion is it in Marseille, the other one you chose? How did you pick that one?
Well, what happened was the two houses that we chose for filming, I think in one of the kind of essential ingredients is that they're both museums that are open to the public. But as they are, they are houses that represent certain habits of the elite. So in Ireland, it's an aristocratic mansion that's turned into a museum, where people can go in and see the lifestyle, the collection of let's say, a kind of colonial past. in Ireland. But then, as it's become a museum, it's accessible by everybody and who pays a ticket. So there is already a shift there in the dynamic of access, let's say, in terms of the concept of access. So normally these houses would never have been accessed by the people, let's say, if you understand what I mean. So a house, a domestic scenario that becomes a museum by itself defines that it's no longer a domestic place, but let's say an institution and a window into the past. And in the instance of the film, we invited artists of traditional music to reevaluate that museological interior, and in many respects redomesticated through the music that they produce in the house. It's a specifically kind of a conversation between the luxury or the luxurious nature of these interiors and their collections, and the kind of the bourgeois nature and of these collections, and the traditional music that represents, in many respects, also a struggle of the people in relation to that very kind of elitist interior, if you know what I mean.
So the music is really the music of the people, of the working class, or of normal people, so to speak, as opposed to like for any sort of aristocratic setting, is it?
Yeah, it's music of those countries that's not necessarily represented in those establishments which are of the elite. So
yeah.
And we're returning back to this question of Brexit. You know, the scene of Irish music in Ireland is extremely, I'm just referring to Ireland at the moment, is extremely strong until today. It's very much a national export, but a great deal of that music refers to a past of resistance and struggle and loss and migration. And for example, the first song that's sung is called Roisin Dove, and it's from the the 1500s, or at least that's an earlier tracing, but it's probably much older. Within the song, although it's a kind of a love story, it has an embedded political message. So in Irish traditional music, there's often embedded messages for the people in terms of their struggle against a colonial oppressor. So when Ireland then becomes a European country, what happens when this traditional music refers to a struggle of the past that is no longer essentially felt today, as in terms of this kind of changes in political dimension. But when we extended the research to include North African music in Ireland, is because we were inspired by a documentary series made by one of the participants in the film, called Bob Quinn, who was a documentary filmmaker from the west coast of Ireland. He considers himself an Irish-speaking, a Gaeilgeoir documentary filmmaker. So Gaeilgeoir is the Irish-speaking area of the west coast of Ireland. He was also the first person to make a feature film in the Irish language, which was only in the 80s. So you can see how the Irish language is also kind of like was set to the side in many respects, including by the people in Ireland. It was kind of at that time still considered to be somehow backward or lost, and people would move and advance towards English as their chosen language. But in his documentary film series, Bob provokes another form of looking at history, which was that he created a theory, or he recognized the potential of a theory that the Irish culture, the Irish people, don't stem necessarily from this myth of the Celtic culture, and the Celts are considered to be European, across European tribes that came to Ireland, but instead that the roots of Irish culture is from North Africa. And his reasoning is very potentially true and very believable in many respects, because in a kind of prehistoric period of time, like ship-faring peoples would use the motorway of the ocean through the Mediterranean and around the coast. And
okay, I'm just going to edit that.
Okay,
together.
so yeah, fair enough. So he created a theory that ship-faring peoples, which he calls Atlanteans, is also the name of his documentary series, brought aspects of song and culture and elements of language to the west through the Mediterranean basin along the coast and around the top of Ireland and Scotland. So in Brittany and on the west coast of Ireland and in Scotland, we have a kind of a very similar set of cultural echoes, you might say, that he believes originated from the north of Africa in the basin.
Can you give an example for that?
Yeah, well, the Shannon singing is probably a very good example. And that's the singing that's produced mainly on the west coast of Ireland. That's not exactly something that came from anywhere in Ireland, except that it was the strongest part in the north of Ireland. And it's very much it has a very, very close association to the how do you call it, the morning song, I think it's called. I've forgotten the name. It's too early for me here, but the Arab singing of for God, you know.
Yeah. Okay.
It's a melismatic. I suppose the best way to describe it is its melismatic qualities. So, and melismatic means a whole change in the tonality of voice and how the singer embodies it in many respects. It's the evasion of the actual person, and it's a concentration on the song. So the singer has to embody entirely 100% the emotional spectrum of the music that's sung. They become kind of one with the nature of the singing and the song itself and the message of the song. So this is something very, very similar. And there's also, of course, in many respects, if we look at in art forms like Celtic banding and Celtic design and Islamic design, or dancing, there's very particular dancing.
What I think is so lovely about your film is we talked about these aristocratic backgrounds or these houses, you know, by origin belonging to upper class people, whether they're aristocratic or not, and then these musicians sort of claim the space for them. They make it their own. One of them even puts his foot on this old chair, and they just really take over, which is fascinating considering the you know, the opulence of the place. And this opulence can sometimes be a little intimidating as well and overbearing. So what was did you give them free rein, or what did you talk to them in terms of maybe the political aspect of this?
Yeah, for sure. And it's nice that you mentioned that he puts his foot on the chair, and in every instance there is an interaction with the space that goes beyond what one would do in a museum environment like this, that we have to hold in you know, in high regard and not touch and everything. So the idea of them interacting physically with the space, like the two Occitan singers, you know, he hits it with the tuning fork. Mona, who sings at the end, she opens the window. All of these things that you would never consider doing in a museum space. So it is very much about a reclaiming of the space. In many respects, I think to assuage the maybe the negative forms of the past, and to reclaim that space, and to probably in many respects put historic inequalities to rest, to understand that history is something that we don't have to necessarily maintain in our physical, in our beings anymore. That we can look at it and accept it, and then therefore move on. So I was also really intrigued by the fact that while we were making that film, which happened over the pandemic itself also brought a lot of these questions of our history and our inequality to the foreground. You know, so the BLM movement that was happening in the United States, there was a lot of felling of statues that was going on of ex-slave owners, changing of names of institutions. And I think in many respects, a kind of a more general understanding that of readdressing these institutional kind of forms of inequality and racism was happening at the same time. And I think the pandemic, for all the negative reasons for us not to want to have to go through that again, when something like that happens, it shows us a little bit more clearly the very nature of these unequal situations that we live through on a daily basis. You know, there's a certain undertone of violence that occurs for people. Like Marseille as a city, because we made it like there's two very kind of distinct chapters that mirror each other. There's first in Ireland with the tour with the Irish participants, the Irish artists in an aristocratic house, and in France, the North African peoples in France in a bourgeois house. So with the tour guide that occurs in both places, I think if we were to take the script of what people are saying, it's a very simple, small script, but it also relates to the development across the, like, let's say the industrial period, where the bourgeoisie started to come up and also take very much these aspects of aristocratic life and incorporate them into their own understanding, but take a certain amount of that power away from the bourgeoisie, from the aristocracy. So the very initial thing that Bruno, the tour guide in France, is talking about is how the owner of the house, Grobet Labadier, which is a museum, it's a hotel particulier, decided on this crescent around the Palace of Longchamp, decided to turn the house to not face the Longchamp, and it set it back from the street. So it's kind of literally like saying, you know, we have our independence, we have our own power. We don't need to correspond to the aristocracy anymore, even though they still remain with all the same kind of aristocratic pretensions, which is to collect. And of course, his collections are 99% of the time based on a colonial power and colonial sort of exploitation. So the continuation of that trend is pretty evident there as well. Although the portraits he talks about are no longer portraits of the family to instill the power of that family, but bought portraits that represent power, but are not necessarily members of a given family. So there's lines that are of tracing throughout the two chapters that connect to each other, but don't necessarily overlap or contradict each other, if you know what I mean.
And one final question, how did you pick your performers? Did you also choose the kind of songs they were performing, or was it their choice?
Well, because Barbara and I have been working for the last 9 or 10 years, we've developed over that period of time, even I think from the very first film onwards, a collaborative nature in terms of our work with artists. In all of our films, we're working with artists from background of music production, dance, poetry, and so on and so forth. So when it comes to our films, we understand, first of all, we're making a portrait of the artists with them. So it's a collaborative process of auto performance, you might say. What we provoke in terms of the dynamic is maybe extending it beyond the portrait that's in isolation, but a portrait that tries to look at the entire scenario from which the music production and the form of the artistic form that they produce in relation to the background of their existence and the place where they're from and so on. So in many respects, it's a little bit like this. When it comes to describing, it's harder to describe to you why it would be interesting for them to sing in these places. But when we talk to the artists, there's no question about it. They understand immediately what our proposal is, and they think that, oh, that's an interesting idea. So it's like it's what they do, but we bring it to another place. So it's not necessarily the place that they always operate in terms of the dance or music or singing, of course, but it provoke another reading of exactly what they do within the nature of the background and within the nature of the environment that we propose to do it in. Mm-hmm. So when it comes to researching who and for what reason, it's often connected to the form of music, which can be kind of, this may be more where Barbara comes in terms of journalistic interest. It's these particular forms, in order to maybe hold a fan of knowledge that, you know, they're connected forms, but it's got an awful lot to do with affinity as well, and you know, we meet people, and if we have similar interests and you know, and natural affinities, then of course it can work much better. Mm-hmm. And nice. If we approach an artist, or if we get to know an artist who doesn't see things in the same way as us, then or we don't develop that affinity, then it's most likely that we wouldn't work with them, or they wouldn't work with us. So it really has a lot to do with you know, like understanding and curiosity as well. Mm-hmm. Their curiosity to work with us, and our curiosity about the form that defines their artistic practice. So it can be quite fluid in terms. This is the nicest part about it. It can be quite fluid to understand who we're going to work with and for what reason. And it's a bit like that.
Thank you, Benjamin de Burke, for giving us this insight into your fascinating background and your fascinating way of working. And please give our regards to Barbara. And good luck with the film. And we hope to see you again soon at Max Ophüls Preis.
Thank you very much, Tanya, and have a lovely day. Take care.